contact session 4. So I'm going back to that. So we are running a bit behind, but we're just going to have to try and catch up. I'm going to try and I'm going to move through some material a bit faster in order to catch up before, so that we can finish. Hopefully finish on Saturday. Yeah. All right. So this is. Can you see? Yes, you can see my slides. So this is the. So we kind of spoken about validity and reliability in the last session. I was going to do a demonstration of how we test. We can do a statistical test for validity when we have some data. It's for one type of validity when we have data. But that's, I'm not going to do that, but just be aware that if you have a data set and you're using some kind of measurement that has been used before, there are ways you can statistically test for the validity of that measurement. And we're going to be talking about measurement and data collection tools now. So that's the next kind of component. So we're kind of moving down a level to the, if I can get the slide to move. So we're moving down the research or into the research onion to the data collection and data analysis components for the rest of the session, and for the last unit. Those units are about sort of creating, or how we measure data, and then how we analyze data. So that's what we're going to be focusing on now. So we're kind of moving beyond the conceptualization phase into the measurement phase for our study. All right. So at this point we've spoken about populations and sampling. We've spoken about research designs. We've spoken about formulating a research problem. And now the student needs to start collecting data. So they need to choose a data collection instrument. And just a quick anecdote about that. I was just talking to a colleague earlier, and he was on the phone. He was on a call with a researcher who's working with another one of my colleagues, and they're doing an online survey. And he was asking my colleague to talk to my coworker because so she's helping with an online survey, and he was complaining because she wouldn't make the questions compulsory on the online survey, and so he was asking for her to do that. So I said, no, well, we can't do that because that's ethically problematic. So this is the kind of realm that we're moving into in terms of helping students with research and what they can do and what they can't do. Okay, so when we choose a data collection instrument, you can use a new instrument, or you can adapt an existing instrument, or you can use an existing instrument as it is. So there's different options for the student when we are starting to look at the instruments that we're going to use to collect data. And so just a quick question that you can try and answer: what are the tools or instruments that we can use to get quantitative information? So if we're doing a quantitative study, or if a student's doing a quantitative study, what's available for them to get that quantitative information? What could they use? And this is broad. So any kind of design. We're talking about experimental design or survey design. What do you think students could use to collect data? Any question? Any suggestions? Okay, you're all out of the office making tea. Okay. Yes.
Questionnaire.
The survey questionnaires.
Surveys and questionnaires.
Oh, we all talking. Oh, okay.
Yes, two of you are talking. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So questionnaires are one method of collecting data. Yeah. So I think one of you said questionnaires and surveys, but just remember the survey is the research design. The survey is not what we use to collect the data. The survey is the approach that we use. So that's suggesting that we're going to sort of get a big sample, and we want to able to generalize. The actual tool that we use to collect data is the questionnaire. So although we talk about an online survey, we know the instrument that we use to collect the information is an online questionnaire. The survey is the broad approach. Okay. So yeah, so that's one kind of common thing. Mfundo, you want to say something?
What about structured observations?
Yes, yeah, structured observation is another form of data collection. Another
observation checklist, using your coding sheets. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Well,
sorry, Theodora, I can hear you.
Self-assessments.
Self-assessments, yeah. So that would be some kind of it's like a form of a question, a specialized form of a questionnaire. Yeah. Sort of documents. Okay. So let's look. So none of you have mentioned. Sorry, Tabor, did you want to say something? I'm going back quickly before you look at the slide.
No, I wanted to ask about focus group. Where do we put them?
Okay, so focus groups would normally be for qualitative work, I think generally.
Oh, it's qualitative. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely a method that we would use for data collection, but I think it would normally be more associated with qualitative.
Okay.
Experiments. I think experiments falls under quantitative. For example, if you'll be collecting, it's just that I'm not good in quantitative, but I'm thinking about the lab equipment. Some people need equipment, and there will be a lot of things that they will be testing to collect data in labs. So yes, I think experiments as well. I remember in grade 10, 12, when we did biology, where we were testing the DNA in an onion. So we required lab, we required paraffin, we required filters, we required a stove. So there were a lot of equipments that were needed in order to prove that there is a DNA in an onion.
Right. Okay. It's interesting. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So these are some of the data collection tools that a student could use. So there's instruments, there's equipment, machines. So for example, an electron microscope, a petri dish, algometer, spectrophotometer, scale. So there's a whole range of instruments that researchers use to measure variables. And we'll talk about those briefly. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about machinery. You could also in some ways argue that a computer could generate information as well. So a computer could generate data. So that's another source of another piece of equipment that can create data. Questionnaires are a common, the data collection tool that we most interact with in our service is a questionnaire. There's also documents, as Theodora said, so that could include patient reports, for example, patient records, but that can also include things like documents, the web pages. It could be social media groups. You could get content from social media groups, which I would sort of put and I would categorize as part of documents as a source, because it's like a page that you're looking at, or like a record that you're looking at. Interviews, I've put interviews here, but they're not necessarily interviews are normally qualitative, but you could potentially, if you've got enough interviews, you might be able to quantify some of the results. And the same would apply for focus groups there, because focus groups are a form of interview. It's a group form of an interview. So if you've got a big project where they're doing lots of focus groups, you might be able to quantify some of the information from a focus group. There's also a sort of group of methods called participatory methods, which are not very commonly known. They use them, and they're mainly they originated in development studies, in the discipline of development studies. And some of those, they're very interesting techniques for measuring relationships and so on, but and some of those can be quantitative in nature. They're generally qualitative, but some of the methods can give you quantitative information as well. And then there's, as Funda said, there's observation. Structured observation is normally associated with quantitative data, and then participatory observation is normally associated with more qualitative designs. So these are the sources of data. I'm not going to go into detail about each one of them, but those are the. So, for example, what I'm seeing a lot of in some research is students using data from social media sites, for example. And I think I've mentioned before, there are ethical questions around that. It's not. We have to be careful with ethics because it's a new area. It's a relatively new source of data. So you need to be careful about how you use the information, how we sample using social media groups, that kind of thing. But it's an interesting new kind of relatively new area of information, source of information. All right. So just a quick question. Just maybe each of you can say what kind of tools, although just try and stick to quantitative, but if you can only answer using a qualitative option, that's also fine. So what tools have you used to collect data, and what tools do your students use to collect data for their research? I'm going to start, Mfunda, you start quickly.
The tools that I've used to collect data in my discipline, I'll say the interviews, the semi-structured or focus groups interviews, and I've also used I've also used systematic literature review, where I get data on EBSCOhost, Google Scholar, and other academic online repository, library, and yeah, those are the platforms where I've been collecting data. Because my students are limited to human participation in terms of collecting data, we considering the issue of ethics. We have actually urged students to strictly adhere on the internet in terms of data collection. They analyze websites, they analyze social media posts, they analyzed social media engagement hashtags, campaign, and etc.
Okay, yeah. I think there's some very interesting dynamics going on in social media as well. It's quite a fascinating area. Okay. Tebogo, what tools do you use to collect data and your students?
So on my case, we collect raw data, Doc. So normally, if we need traffic data, we'll go to Central, and then Central, they will give us the data that they already have at hand. So we'll take that raw data or image data or video data. Those are the type of data we analyze. We don't collect primary data most of the time.
Okay, so
unless we have designed an interface, then we'll collect qualitative data because we want users to test that interface and give us feedback.
Okay, so it's mainly secondary analysis.
Mainly, yeah, and then primary when we want them to test one of the artifacts.
Yeah. Okay. So it's an app sort of it's like an evaluation of the artifact. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And what do you when you do that? Is it like a survey that you're doing? Is it like a user survey, or how does it work? When you do the artifact evaluation.
Pardon, talk, Doc. I didn't get that.
So when you do the evaluation of the artifact, do you get users to give you feedback on the on the ease of use and the usefulness and so on?
Yes, we do all of those ones. It's either maybe we'll maybe do an observation. We give them the app and then we observe how they interact with it, or we will ask them to give feedback, verbal feedback or written feedback in terms of. Then we'll use that qualitative data to now maybe analyze further.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like you're doing a questionnaire in a way.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Theodora.
I have never assessed students on quantitative. We've been using qualitative tools.
Yeah. So what
like interviews, focus groups.
Okay. Yeah.
And then we come up with themes and sub-themes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Corin?
Sorry, I was looking for the mute button.
Yeah.
Also qualitative, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, etc. That would be the primary way I have collected data.
Okay, good. Okay. So yeah, so just we're not going to talk about interviews, but they can be really, really. I mean, obviously they're very effective at. If you do a good interview, you can get really, really good information from people. So that is a good methodology. Obviously, it's a well-established methodology. I spoke about. I got involved in a sort of email interaction at the university here to do with Atlas TI, and it seems like there's a new software application called AI Analyze or AI Lies or something, which can do an interview for you. It's like an AI program which can create. It seems like I need to look into it, but it sounds fascinating. So maybe they're going to do away with us as interviewers. Yes, sorry, Corin.
So it sounds like we've just done some stuff at work with a company who creates synthetic humans. So they aren't actually humans, they're created as AI, and we've done some research on those, which is like quite bizarre and mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So that sounds like what you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So with this application, apparently it's quite pricey to buy the software, but apparently you can, if you've got a whole bunch of. So we often do questionnaires where the person has an open-ended question, and then you get a lot of answers. Sometimes the answers are quite superficial, but you can get some quite detailed responses from participants, and it's always difficult to know how to analyze. If you've got 1,000 responses, how do you then analyze these open-ended responses? But apparently this program can do it for you. You have to, I think you have to kind of help it decide what the categories are going to be and so on, but it's still kind of instead of you having to go through every answer and code it and so on, it can do it for you automatically. So I think it's a bit like in Vivo or Atlas, but more geared towards automating the process of analysis. I think in Atlas you still have to. I suppose you can search in Atlas, so you can do it automatically in a way. But I think this program just reads through all the information and sort of groups the responses into response. That it creates responses from the responses, kind of, or creates categories from the responses. So very interesting things happening. Mfundo, did you want to say something? I saw your hand go up, I think.
No, Doc, I was lowering my hand. I think it was up.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay. All right. So what's clear from this, and I could see it from your responses to assignment 1 as well, the qualitative is strong in this group. so you need to so I think it would be good to, if you want to develop as a researcher, is to kind of try a quantitative a project just to see how it works, and because it's a good complement for the qualitative as well. Qualitative, so although I'm not a qualitative person myself, I still have a huge respect for qualitative research, and it's very valuable. I think, but it's good to get that balance between the two, because as we said earlier on, the strength of the one approach is the weakness of the other, and vice versa. So it's good to use both. Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about instruments and equipment and machines, but just a story about when I first started as a student. I went to one of the first conferences I ever went to. I was doing biology, and another student was presenting a paper, and one of the lecturers, he was presenting some figures saying that this machine was showing some value or other, and one of the people in the audience said, "But all you're showing there is the baseline of the machine. It's not showing any value." And it was a horrible experience, because the student was trying to say, well, I think it is the measurement, and then the person sitting there said, no, it's just you're just showing a baseline. So it was a very awkward interchange between the student and this person who seemed to know about the equipment and so on. They never really kind of sort of resolve the sort of argument during the presentation. So it was a bit awkward, and it was not a good introduction to conferences to know that you could be attacked like that. so yeah, so it's just an interesting story about machines and equipment. So, and I have used instruments as a biologist to do experimental work, and so I've used electron microscopes, and I've used what are they called, protein. I can't remember what they're called now. It's so long ago since I did the work. But we used to measure protein bands and so on. So we used to use a lot of equipment and machinery for that. So one of the key things about it is that you want your machine to be accurate, which speaks to the validity, and reliable. So you wanted to measure the right component, and you wanted to measure it consistently. So that part of that will involve calibration. So if you think about when we use scales, if you're using a scale to measure food, for example, if you're using a scale to measure body weight, we have to set it so that it goes to the value of 0, and then we stand on the machine, or we put food onto the weight, and then that gives us should give us an accurate measure of what we're trying to measure. The problem would come in as if it's not accurate. If there's a problem, if the scale isn't working properly and it doesn't give us a good measurement, then we're going to end up with sort of dodgy information. And part of the process of making sure the machine is working right will come from calibration. So departments that have these machines would often have to call in a technician to calibrate the machine and make sure it's working properly. Just to use a non-research based example would be a piano, where you have to tune the keys every now and then, because they go out of, if you play a piano for a long time, the keys stop working properly. So you have to get a tuner in to retune the piano so the keys sound correct again. And the same thing would apply for the machines and often scientists would use machines, but also health sciences as well. There's a lot of machinery used in health sciences and in engineering, and lots of disciplines will use machinery. One element would be the cost of the machine. Some of the equipment is very expensive. So you need a budget to pay for the machines and for the maintenance. Sometimes you need somebody to operate the machine. So when I was a biologist, we had a technician who looked after the microscopes, because they're very big machines. They're very sensitive. They need you need to know what you're doing when you're using them. So we had the department that I worked in, or that I studied in, had a technician who was employed to make sure the machines were being used properly and so on. You need technical support to use that. Sometimes you might need technical support to use the machine. And then you also have to think about alternatives. So is there a different one that you could use? So I had a meeting with a student the other day, and her research is about she actually works in an area where they sell machines doing bone density scans. And there's different companies that make and sell those machines. So her study's not about the companies and things, but it's just when I was chatting to her, she mentioned that there are different companies that make the machines and sell them. So that market them to different medical facilities and so on. So those are some things that you need to consider when you're using machinery and equipment and so on. Just to say also, when you're doing biological work, so for example, you might be doing work where you need to measure. So often when they're working with bacteria, for example, they'll use a petri dish to see how a fungus is growing or how bacteria grows in response to a particular treatment, for example. So all those kinds of experimental scenarios, you need to be very careful about control and have a clean environment, because you don't want some kind of contaminant coming into the laboratory and then affecting your lab results and so on. So yeah, so these are all things that you need to think about when you're using equipment in the lab. Right, so that, I'm not going to talk much more about that. Usually you can hopefully be fairly confident that the measurements that you're getting from instruments and equipment is accurate, because as long as you maintain the instrumentation and it's good quality instrumentation and so on. Okay, I'm going to focus mainly on questionnaire design, because that's the instrument that we mostly use for data collection in the human social sciences. And in the health sciences, we do a lot of questionnaires for the students from health sciences as well. So all disciplines can use questionnaires as a source of data. Just to ask a question, if you were developing a questionnaire as a data collection tool, what are some of the criteria you would include on a checklist to develop a high quality questionnaire? So what kind of questions or criteria what kind of questions would you ask, or what kinds of criteria would you think would be important in order to make sure that you get a high quality questionnaire? Just one or two suggestions.
Can I take a try?
Okay,
Can I try?
Yeah. Mfunda and Theodora, you both competing with each other this evening. Okay, Theodora, you go first this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think one question should include all the elements of the phenomenon that is in question, to answer the question that is the research question.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So your questionnaire must include, all the components, all the relevant components for your study.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Mfundo, you had a suggestion?
I think Theodora said it's paramount to include all the elements of that are required to be in the questionnaire. I was just going to say that one of the criteria, the criteria that I would use, to include in my checklist when I'm developing a high quality questionnaire. I think the first thing is to indicate the purpose and the objectives of the study, so that the people that are participating in my questionnaire are able to comprehend or to understand the purpose and the objective of the study, and they can be able to see, or as the researcher, I will be able to see if there is an alignment with the questions that I have provided in the questionnaire. They align with the research goal or research objectives. And also, the ethical consideration is very important, that it is included in the questionnaire, because some people feel that they are coerced to participate in the study, whereas in the ethical consideration is the informed consent addressed at the beginning, for example, so that people know that no one is being compelled to participate in the study.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this one is important, testing and the validation. Has the questionnaire been pre-tested? But I think this is very important. To pre-test or to pilot test. I know that I've done that in my BTech. I still remember that, yes.
Yeah, Good. Okay, those are nice suggestions. So just to say, yeah. So with the when it comes to the purpose and objectives of the study, you need to kind of think about how much information you want to give the participant, because you don't. Because remember, you're doing the work for an academic purpose. They might not necessarily sort of align with that academic purpose. So, for example, I've just recently been reviewing a questionnaire, and then the researcher had sort of at the head of a section, at the beginning of a section, she'd sort of cited the reference where the questions came from, but that's not relevant for the participant. They don't know anything about that reference. They don't need to know where the questions come from. What's important for them is just to know what the questions are kind of focusing on, not the source of the questions or the sort of academic background of that questions, unless it's in a very academic environment where the people might understand that. But it's not, most of the time, I think in the majority of research, the participants won't be familiar with the academic work that's been done behind the questionnaire kind of thing. So I think that's one thing to consider. So I agree in principle that we need to, and it's very important to indicate what the study is about, but you also don't want to go into, you don't want to have a long introduction going into lots and lots of detail about the project, because that's also going to put people off because they're having to read too much. So you have to find that balance between explaining what the study is about, and then also, but not giving, so much information that you put the person off because you've got this very long introduction. The ethical considerations are also important. And sorry, you also mentioned aligned with research goals. So that, I think it's important for you as the researcher to make sure that's happening. The participant doesn't necessarily need to be aware of those things in a detailed way, again, because they're not sort of party to what the research is about in a very in-depth way. So I think, yeah, so they will understand what's going on, but they don't necessarily need to be sort of, they won't be fully involved in the design and so on, and what the research concepts are and so on and so forth. So that's more for the researcher to make sure that their questions are aligned with their objectives. Not necessarily, the participants don't need to necessarily know what the objectives are and that the questions are aligned to that. What would be a problem is if the questions aren't aligned, and then you're asking people to fill out, because you're essentially wasting their time then. Because if you've got a bad questionnaire and you're asking people to fill it out, you're not doing them a favor by doing that. And then the ethical considerations, so sometimes the ethical considerations will be included in a letter rather than in the questionnaire itself. So there's certain parts of the ethics requirements that we need to meet, like anonymity and confidentiality. They can be included on the questionnaire, but again, you need to kind of be careful about balancing how much information you're putting to the person in the questionnaire versus you might be able to do it in an introduction letter, which you then send to the person, and then that might include the comments about anonymity and confidentiality and so on. In the questionnaire itself, there are important ethics issues around right to refuse to answer questions and that kind of thing. So, and also just dropping out of the process if they want to. So if they start answering the questionnaire, you don't want to force the person to finish it if they don't want to finish answering the questionnaire. And then you also need to find ways of allowing them to skip questions if they don't want to answer the questions. So as I mentioned, the example I mentioned earlier, where this researcher is asking my colleague to make all the questions compulsory in an online survey, that's a big no-no from an ethics perspective. People do it all the time, but it's a very bad thing to do. Okay, yeah, Mfundo, sorry, you want to say something?
Well, thank you, Doc, for the clarity. The reason I stated those points is because when we developed the survey questionnaire, we were the questionnaire. Sorry, when we were told to develop a questionnaire, we were told to not to generalize and make assumptions about the participants of the study. So that's why I indicated those. I thought maybe they are important, but thank you for the clarification. I was thinking about the tone of questions as well, because I think it should be one of the priority when we are developing a questionnaire to make it comprehensive for the participants. The tone, the language that is being used, it must be appropriate and in such a way that we avoid ambiguity. People tend, especially what I've came across, there are people that tend to use vocabulary, and people don't have time to be consulting dictionaries, especially if they're filling in your survey questionnaire. Your questionnaire, then I don't have time to go and find the meaning of something. I just want to do it. I want to read and understand and answer the question the way I understood it, without having to consult Google or without even having to go to the dictionary. I've been thinking about, let's say now you are conducting a study, and the people that you are targeting are people that are not English-speaking people, for example, and they do understand, but they from the countryside or they from rural areas. So is it important to provide some translation in the questionnaires so that they can understand?
Yeah, so definitely, just to deal with that point first, there's certainly no reason why you can't translate a questionnaire, and researchers quite often do that, depending on their target population, obviously. Yeah, so you can, yeah, there's definitely a sort of place for translation. Just to go back to the tone, also to say though that if your comment about people in the countryside, for example, it also links into the tone and the academic nature of the questionnaire and so on. You have to use a tool which is appropriate for your sample. So if you are targeting people where a questionnaire wouldn't work because it's not the right kind of instrument, then that's where something like participatory methods, for example, would come into play. And they're really not used very often. Not a lot of people are aware of them, and they're not used a lot in research. And I think there's space for using participatory methods in a much more kind of a much wider way than they use currently. I think one of the problems is that not many people know about them, and because those methods, the reason why they're called participatory methods is the participants in the study have a lot of control over what's kind of done, and what's discussed and the responses that they give. Whereas in a questionnaire, it's very much researcher driven. You kind of decide what the topic is, you decide what the questions are going to be. In a participatory method, there might be an approach that you use, but the participants have a lot of control over what's discussed, what the key issues are identified. So, for example, you might do something. I'm just using one example. There's something called a Venn diagram, where they can create a Venn diagram based. You might ask them a question, who are the most important role players in the village, and they can use a Venn diagram to demonstrate. So the Venn diagram, it's an image based kind of process where the bigger the circle, the more important the person or the institution is. So you can use something like that, and they get to decide what the biggest thing is, what the biggest institution is. It's not you, the researcher, deciding it; it's the participants deciding it. So if you're working with a sample or a population where a questionnaire isn't the right instrument to use for different reasons, and it could be because of a language issue or because of an understanding issue, because a questionnaire is very sort of top down. It's developed by the researcher, and it might be just the wrong thing to use in a given context. There are other methods that you can use, and that's where you say, okay, well, the questionnaire is not the right instrument to use. The participation method is the more appropriate instrument. So I've got a nice example of the use of participatory methods. It was and they used it with children in India. It's a study based in India where they were asking children questions about household roles and so on. But they didn't use a questionnaire there. They used participatory methods to get the kids to explain, what role their mother and their father played and what roles they played in the community and that kind of thing. So it's a much more effective method than a questionnaire for those kinds of contexts. So and then just your comment about the tone or the language used in a questionnaire is very valid. So what a common problem we see with students is that they'll develop a questionnaire, but they're coming at it from a very academic, they're studying, they're doing a degree, they're reading up about all these concepts in academic journals. So what they do is they translate that academic language into their questionnaire, so it becomes a very academic questionnaire, and it doesn't really you need to kind of generate a questionnaire that the participants will understand. And if you put it in a very high academic language, lots of populations won't understand that language, so you need to find words which are appropriate for lay persons or people in normal people in society that are not seeing the concepts from an academic perspective. It's a common sort of thing where literally sometimes what happens is the students take the kind of the concept from the paper, from a research paper, and they sort of plonk it into a questionnaire and expect the person to read that concept and understand what it is, and it's not going to happen. So you need to reframe it in a much simpler language for the person and this, for the person to understand. If you're doing a questionnaire with experts, it's a different story, because then you can give them that language because they'll understand it. But when you're talking to, most of the time we're dealing with people who are not academics, so they need to have the wording in a language which is much more understandable. So yeah, very good points. Okay, so I'm going to show you a list that I developed, which is not, it's just my list. So these are some of the mistakes that that students can make when they design a questionnaire. The questions don't correspond with constructs to be measured, and that's a kind of point that Theodora made about, making sure that you have the constructs that you want to measure in the questionnaire. So that would be an example of that. So so you say that, so the student says that they want to do a particular analyze a particular study, but then they don't actually measure those things in the questionnaire, and we see that fairly often. Important questions are omitted, so there's no dependent variable. I had a case like that quite recently where a PhD student had a questionnaire, but there was no dependent variable measured in the questionnaire, so we sort of added that in. The ordering of the questions can be problematic. So we sometimes get, what happens is the student will kind of start with a biographical question, and then they'll jump to a question about the work environment, and then they'll jump back to another biographical question. So the logical order of the questions is not sort of a very good order. This is very higgledy-piggledy in terms of the content of the questions. Questions are poorly worded, overly academic. Usually it's usually that the wording is too academic, or it can also just be that it's very long-winded sentences. Sometimes the wrong response anchors are used. That's a big problem. So what happens, we often get people using questionnaires where they'll use an agree-disagree scale, but that's not always the best scale to use. And I'll show you later that there's different options. There's different options we can use for response anchors. I think I've got it in this set of slides. I might be wrong, but yeah. Then there's also sometimes what students do is they just they have sections on their questionnaire, but they don't have any introduction to the section. So they'll have a heading and they'll have a question A, a question 1 or question 2, but there's no they don't ease the person into the questionnaire and into that section. And it sort of links to what you were saying, Mufunu, about sort of respecting the participant and giving them some kind of insight as to what's going to be covered. So if you're covering biographical questions, have a heading there, biographical question, and then have a brief introduction, sort of letting the person know that that section is going to be biographical questions, and that they must just choose the response option which is best suited to them, or most appropriate for them. Also, instructions are not absent or not clear, and I think you did mention about. I think that was also mentioned as a criteria. So you need to make sure the participant knows what's going on with the questionnaire. We can also have situations where the filtering and branching is not clear, or leads to a loss of responses for a group of participants. And I had a case of that, a meeting 2 days ago with a questionnaire where the questionnaire did say to the person, if you received in-person training, please answer this question. And then the next question was, if you did not receive in-person training, please answer this question. But somehow almost everybody answered both questions, and I'm not sure why. So the participants weren't reading the questions properly, and it was an online survey, but the researcher hadn't put a branching structure in. So everybody answered the question about in-service training, even though half the sample probably didn't have the in-service training, or in-person training, not in-service training. So we can't really use the answers to those two questions because we're not sure why everybody answered them, and we don't know which of the people that answered them are the people that had the in-person training or didn't have the in-person training. So that can be a problem. A long questionnaire can also be a problem. Long questionnaires will lead to dropout as people are answering them. But there is a trade-off between, it's the point that Theodora made, is that the questionnaire must include questions which answer your research questions. So if you, and there's a very good text by an author who's a scale expert, who's an expert in developing scales. And his argument is that you must, the length of the questionnaire is more, you must, so it's important to include questions in the questionnaire to answer your research questions. And if that means the length is very long and you get a smaller sample size, that's the kind of trade-off that you need to make. So you must focus more on the questions than on getting a very big sample size. So you can have a short questionnaire and get a very big sample size, but you might not then be covering the sort of concepts that you need to be covering. So there's a trade-off there, and it's usually the longer the questionnaire, the smaller the response rate is going to be. Yeah, and then the formatting is poor. That's also a big problem. So I've got one sort of example where it's a long questionnaire and it's not really very well formatted, and it's very difficult to do the data capture accurately from a questionnaire like that. So there's a number of reasons why the formatting is important, and one of the big reasons, one reason is that it doesn't look very professional if you've got a poorly formatted questionnaire. So the participant will probably be sitting there thinking, why is it such a poorly formatted questionnaire? And then another reason would be when you're trying to capture the data, you might have inaccuracies because the formatting is sloppy. So those are things that you need to look out for. These are the kinds of problems we see with student questionnaires. Okay, so this is the list that I've developed, and I'm going to go through it quite quickly. So the first question is the questionnaire the best option to answer your research questions? Not just that, but is it the best option for the sample that you're targeting in the study? Linking back to what Mfumo was saying about if you have a group of people that a questionnaire is not really going to work for, either because of language or because of knowledge, can they respond to this questionnaire? You might need to use a different option. Sometimes an interview might be a better option than a questionnaire, depending on who you're targeting. Okay, then the next question is, do you have a sound theoretical model? And then we're linking that back to the theory. Do you have clearly defined constructs, variables measured? Is there a pre-existing questionnaire or set of questions you can use? And is that pre-existing questionnaire or set of questionnaires valid and reliable? So those are some of the questions that I would ask if I was wanting to use a question or thinking about using a questionnaire as a data collection instrument. So then to continue, I'm just going to go through the whole list first. Am I clear about what I'm going to measure in each section of the questionnaire? That goes back to Theodora's comment about having everything that you need in the questionnaire, and then putting it into nice sections. Then another question is, am I clear what form each question should take? Because we can ask different kinds of questions. Are you clear what response type will come from a question? And those response types are really important for analysis purposes. You'll see there's a link between the response options that we get from a questionnaire and the kind of analysis that we can do. And I'll make that link with the analysis plan. Do I have an analysis plan for the variables? Is the wording of my question clear and unambiguous? That's what Mfuna was asking about, or saying about, are your questions well framed? Is the tone of the question acceptable, and so on? Have you included important information and instructions for the interviewer and participants, and are these clear instructions? Have you explained the necessarily ethical requirements to the participant? That's again another point that Mfuna was making about covering the ethics with your questionnaire. Is the questionnaire a suitable length? Have you achieved a clean and efficient layout with your questionnaire? Do I need to pilot the questionnaire? I think Mfuna also mentioned the piloting of the questionnaire. How will you administer the questionnaire, and what are the implications for the response rates? So are you going to do an in-person questionnaire? Are you going to hand it out at an organization and then go back and fetch it? Are you going to do an online questionnaire? Are you going to do a telephone-based questionnaire? There's different ways of administering the questionnaire. Have you taken necessary steps to ensure a good response rate? And then can you measure reliability and validity from the questionnaire? So once you get some data from the questionnaire, is it possible to measure reliability and validity from that sort of feeds into the variables that you're measuring in the questionnaire? So certain kinds of questions you might be able to measure reliability and validity. Other kinds of measurements you won't be able to. So you need to think about that option. We can't always measure reliability and validity from the results that we get from a questionnaire. Okay, and also to make a note that a number of these criteria would apply for other research designs as well, not just for sort of quantitative design. Some of these questions are relevant for, so the ethics question, for example, is relevant to doing interviews. It's relevant to doing observation. Under all those kind of conditions, you would need to think about ethics, for example. Okay, so the first question, is my questionnaire the best option for answering my research question? I'm not going to spend a long time on this because we've discussed it already. It's just to make the point that other methods might be more appropriate to answer your research questions, but also bringing into that, I haven't got it on the slide here, but it might also be that the sample that you're targeting, that the questionnaire is not the best option for the sample, and it's related to the research questions, because the research questions will lead you to a sample, and then so that they're related. So it would be to say that in order to answer research questions with that given sample, the questionnaire might not be the best option to use. So sometimes you might be better off using interviews or participatory methods, or maybe some observation, for example. Okay, the questionnaires commonly used for under the survey strategy, an experimental strategy, or a case study strategy. So if you're doing so there's different contexts or different strategies where we can use a questionnaire, and it's commonly associated with the survey strategy, also with experimental designs. So it's the psychologists, for example, or even people in education might be doing some kind of intervention where you've got a pre and a post intervention. So you might be measuring a variable before the intervention and after the intervention. So that would be an experimental design. And you can use questionnaires to measure indicators before and after the intervention. So it's not just used in a survey context. Okay, do you have a sound theoretical model? I'm not going to spend much time on this because we've covered theory already. But if you're doing a quantitative project, there is a chance that you might be testing a theory with your study. And just to use an example here, if you might be asking the question, what is the relationship between subjective norms and recycling behavior? Where subjective norms is the influence other people have on your behavior. So the theory might be that the more you're influenced by other people, the more likely you are to recycle. So you can test that relationship, and you could ask questions in a questionnaire where you measure the subjective norm and you measure the recycling behavior of the individual, and then you can test that theory using the responses that you get from the questionnaire. So this is just going back to an earlier session where we showed this theory, and this is a very simple example of a theory. But it's just to make the point that sometimes when we're using questionnaires, we will be testing a theory. And we do it often in the work that we do. I'm having a meeting tomorrow with a PhD student. I had a meeting this morning with a PhD student where they've used questionnaires to measure constructs, and then they're testing the relationship between those constructs. So that's so those are it's a common kind of design that we use for where questionnaires play a role in looking at a theoretical proposition. All right, so do you have clearly defined constructs, variables, and measures? So this is just we're repeating here what we've already covered, that we're going to when we do a study, we've got concepts that we want to measure, and then we have to define those constructs, and then we have to operationalize them. We have to say how they're going to be measured, and we can use the questionnaire to achieve that operationalization. So this is just kind of covering that particular issue. The chapter that I've recommended that you look at by Blakey has examples of definitions and operationalization of those definitions. So, for example, I'm not going to go through these slides in detail. I want to move on to some other ones. But have a look at that chapter. It's a very good chapter. And the reason why I've recommended it is it has all the components that you need in a proposal and it sort of covers them quite well. So it's got the definitions of the concepts. It explains how they're going to be operationalized, and that's a nice example for a student to kind of, students should be following that kind of example when they develop their proposals. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these definitions. I want to move on to some other ones. Okay, so the operationalization of constructs is critical. That's where the questionnaire comes in, because that's where we're taking our construct from being on paper as a definition to being something that we can measure. So we're moving from a definition on paper to a variable that we can actually get a measurement for. Okay, so operationalization is how we measure a specific construct. So we need to convert a construct into a measure to make it easy to examine and discuss. So we're moving from a sort of a definition on paper to something that we've got measurement for. Factors like affect and cognitive competence, which we'll see later, are referred to as latent constructs. So a latent construct can't be directly measured. We have to or observed. We have to develop a set of questions to measure the latent construct, and we'll look at examples in a minute. And that's different to a manifest variable, which is measurable and observable. So a manifest variable is something like our weight. So we can get onto a scale which has been calibrated, and if it's a good quality scale, we can get a good estimate of a very accurate estimate of our weight in kilograms or grams or whatever measurement that you want to use for your weight. So that's an example of a manifest variable. Another example of a manifest variable would be access to electricity. So you can go to a household and say, do you have electricity? Yes or no, or you can also ask about the reliability of the electricity, and you can also observe that, so you can see it when you see the lights on it in the evening. You know that house has got access to electricity. So that's a manifest variable. A latent variable is something different. It's something that we're conceptualizing it, but we can't measure. So when we talk about self-esteem, we can't measure self-esteem directly. We have to conceptualize it, and then we have to come up with a set of questions which are used to represent that construct. We don't have a single measure for self-esteem. We have to, when we look at examples of those kinds of latent constructs. And also just to note, a questionnaire can include a combination of manifest and latent variables. So you can have both in a questionnaire. Okay, I'm not going to go through this slide. It's just to say that it's just repeating the point about variables, or constructs which are easy to define, and then constructs which are more difficult to define. So it's sort of, And then I think the extra point here is that some variables don't also have a single definition. So there might be more than one definition, and we'll look at some examples just shortly. So you'd have to then, if you're the researcher, you'd have to decide which of the definitions you want to use and which of the operationalizations you want to use. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a second. So it's not always that straightforward as to what you're going to use for your measurement. So when you're using a piece of equipment, it's quite easy because the equipment is designed to measure that particular variable. So for example, an algometer in the health sciences measures pain. So it's a piece of equipment designed to measure pain level. So you can sort of do that. And it's a well-known sort of measurement, but when we come to more to sort of human behavior and so on, excuse me, it's much more complicated in terms of the definitions and the measurements for those. Okay, so this is again this is just taking the Blakey concepts and operationalizing them. You can read the slides to see these and read the chapter. I'm not going to go through these ones. Have a look at that chapter. I'll send you a note to remind you to look at that chapter. And then, so this is just making the link between the definition and the operationalization of the concept. But if you read the chapter, you'll get a better idea of that, how it all fits together. Okay, then this is also from Blakey, so I'm not going to go through this one either. I want to move on to some slightly different definitions. Okay, so this is another example of definitions and operationalize using the concept of attitudes towards statistics. The study was industrial psychology students' attitudes towards statistics, and the purpose of the study, this particular paper that I got this information from, was to determine the reliability and validity of a survey of attitudes towards statistics. And then what they do is they argue that attitudes towards statistics it's a multidimensional concept, and then they say it consists of affective, cognitive, and behavioral components. So there's three kind of components to this attitude towards statistics. Affective is emotions and the motivation related to classes and assessments. So it's the emotional reaction that the student has to having to do statistics. So some people might find it they might be scared of statistics. Other people might be enthusiastic about statistics. So there's different emotions that people might respond to in terms of statistics. Then there's the cognitive, which is the belief in knowledge about your ability to learn statistics and about the discipline. So that's more kind of concrete in a sense. It's, what do you know about statistics, about your ability and so on. And then there's behavioral, which is your action tendencies in studying and performance in examinations. So how do you perform in statistical examinations and so on. So there's those three main components of attitudes, and then they operationalize the instrument by using items. So there's four facets. So I think on this, this is a slightly different version to this. So it's continuing, but they're now using affect, cognitive competence, value, and difficulty. So these are the different components that they're using to measure. That's in a 28 item version. And then they extended that 28 item version to a 36 item version, which also had interest and effort as included in the measurement of the scale. So what they're doing here is they're building questions to measure the components of the attitude towards statistics. Excuse me. So this is just defining the subcomponents. Affect measures students' feelings concerning statistics. Cognitive competence investigates the attitudes about the intellectual knowledge. So this is covering those original components, and now they're being broken down into different, more nuanced components. So here they're kind of just giving the definition of each component, each subcomponent. And then these are the questions that they use to measure the actual components. So affect, which is the student's feelings concerning statistics, would be measured using questions like, I will like statistics, I will feel insecure when I have to do statistics problems, I will get frustrated going over statistics tests in class, I will be under stress during statistics class, I will enjoy taking statistics courses. So this is all about the feelings. I like this, I'll feel frustrated, I'll be stressed, I will enjoy. So those are the words that they're using to describe the feelings about statistics. And then the cognitive competence, a couple of examples of statements. I will have trouble understanding statistics because of how I think. I will have no idea of what's going on. I will make a lot of maths errors in statistics. So that's kind of speaking to their competence of being able to do statistics. So what these authors are arguing is that these questions can be used to measure that concept of affect and of cognitive competence. And then they would have to validate and prove the reliability and the validity of these statements as measuring those components. So this is how we would, so if a student is measuring what we would consider to be a latent construct, they would need to develop questions, or they can use existing questions. So if you had a student who was doing a study about statistical attitudes towards statistics, they could consider using these questions because they've been published and they've been sort of shown to be valid and reliable. The asterisks next to some of the statements just refer to some statements being positively worded and other statements being negatively worded. So that's we sometimes use positive and negative words just to keep the participant honest in terms of, so that they're not just checking agree. They need to read the question first, and then they might click agree or disagree if it's a positive or a negative statement. So we need to catch them out if they. I'm just joking. We don't really catch them out. It's just to keep them honest about their ratings. There can be a statistical problem with the negative and the positive statements, but that's something that we can maybe cover in the analysis section. Okay. These are some examples of constructs linked to research questions. So what I've done here is I've taken some research questions from Blakey's chapter on research questions. He's got in that chapter he has he gives some examples of research questions for the reader to look at. So one of the topics is absenteeism. I'm not going to go into detail about the questions here. But the point here is that absenteeism is a concept that we can measure. And then the next slide. So this is just the questions in relation to absenteeism. And then this next slide gives an example of a construct which measures absenteeism. So there is a scale which measures absenteeism and also presenteeism. So absenteeism is when you're absent from work. Presenteeism is when you're at work but you're not working. So those are the sort of rough definitions of those concepts. And there is a instrument that measures absenteeism, and what they're discussing here in this little paragraph is that can you take, so there's a questionnaire which has a lot of questions, and the question that they're asking here is, can you take a couple of questions from that full questionnaire and use those to measure absenteeism? So it's, can you do an abbreviated measurement of absenteeism? So this person is saying yes, you can. This memo lists the questions that are needed to do this and to describe the scoring rules. If you take out only some questions, if you only use some of the questions, how do you, which ones do you use, and how do you then score for absenteeism? So it's just giving you an indication that if there is an instrument out there, you might be able to take some of the questions and use those fewer questions to measure the construct. And then, so two of the questions that you can use from the longer questionnaire are about how many hours altogether did you work in the past 7 days. So the person gives you a number of hours, and then you code that gets a score. And then how many hours does your employer expect you to work in a typical 7-day week? And that again is another measure of the, it's contributing towards this idea of absenteeism. Okay, so that's, if there's a gap between how many hours you did work and how many hours your employer expects you to work, that would be a sort of considered a sort of part of absenteeism. So that's an example. And then so if you so let's look at moving on. This is job satisfaction. So these are questions measuring job satisfaction. And so the concept here that we're measuring is job satisfaction. And then there's two examples of scales which measure, or questionnaires which measure job satisfaction that I've given here. So the one is called the Job Satisfaction Survey. It's a 36-item, 9-subscale measurement. I'm not going to go into details about the scale. The main points to take from this is that there are different instruments that you can use to measure job satisfaction. And I'm giving you the examples here. So this Job Satisfaction Survey measures pay, promotion, supervision, fringe benefits, contingent rewards, operating conditions, co-workers, nature of work, and communication. So it's got 9 subcomponents to the job satisfaction. So just to note as well that so job satisfaction isn't seen as being a simple thing here. It's got lots of different components to it. So it's not just a simple kind of one question option. You can ask a single question. You could say, how satisfied are you with your job? Very dissatisfied, very satisfied. But that's going to give you a very simplistic measurement of job satisfaction. Okay, so these are this is to show you how we look at reliability of a scale. So this is from the handout on the job satisfaction scale. So you've got these different components: pay, promotion, supervision, fringe benefits, and then you've got a Cronbach alpha for each subscale. And you'll see that operating procedure, so the Cronbach alpha, we want it to be above 0.8 usually. We also accept values of above 0.7. But here we've got, for operating procedures and co-workers, we've got low Cronbach alphas, 0.6 and 0.60, 0.62 and 0.60. So those would be considered weak reliability. So it's not giving a good reliability for these subscales. So that kind of, if you see that kind of information, you'd ask the question, is this a good measurement of job satisfaction to use? Some of the components, like supervision, looks quite good, 0.82, but the operating procedures and co-workers they don't look like that good measures. So we're using the reliability to help us make a decision about whether we should use the scale or not. So if a student was using this, they would need to look at this and say, can I take a risk and use this with this low reliability, or should I look for something else? And I've chosen this deliberately because it's got other problems as well. So if we look at the items which make up the constructs, the pay construct, which has decent reliability, it's not excellent, but it's not bad. I feel I'm being paid a fair amount for the work I do. Raises are too few and far between. I feel unappreciated by the organization when I think about what they pay me. I feel satisfied with my chances for salary increases. So all those questions have something about pay and salary. So that's why it's probably giving a decent reliability. If we look at the concept co-worker construct, which has a weak reliability, 0.6, I like the people I work with. I find I have to work harder at my job because of the incompetence of people I work with. I enjoy my co-workers. There is too much bickering and fighting at work. So the reason why this might not be giving a good reliability is because first of all, you could question whether all the statements are kind of giving a useful representation of an idea of co-workers and the role that they play in your job satisfaction. The first question, I like the people I work with, is fairly it's something that people might say in conversation. So that's probably a good statement. And also, I enjoy my co-workers. I think those two kind of statements are almost closely related to each other. So they would give a good representation of co-workers. I find I have to work harder at my job because of the incompetence of people I work with. That's kind of not really speaking to, it could be speaking to difficulty of work rather than co-workers. And not everyone's, you might like the people I work with, but you might not have people who are incompetent. So you're going to agree with I like the people I work with, but then you're going to disagree with I find I have to work harder because you don't have to. So that's why this construct is not working to give good reliability. And also the last statement, there's too much bickering and fighting at work. You might say you like the people I work with, and you're going to say agree with that because there's not much bickering and so on. So it's the statements are not really kind of working, and they're not all dealing with some kind of common element of co-worker. Two of them are about liking people and enjoying them. One of them is about incompetent people, and one of them is about bickering and fighting. But it's not necessarily that those are happening in the same environment and so on. So it's not so that's probably why those statements are not really working very well. So so it's quite difficult to design measurements. So when we creating constructs, which is what the questionnaire does, it's sometimes quite difficult to create to come up with questions which are giving a good measure of the construct. What I would say about these is the wording is quite plain, so it's quite easy to understand the wording of the question. So most people wouldn't have a problem with that. They are worded in a language which participants will likely understand. Okay, the second job satisfaction scale, which is it's called the Benjamin Rose Nurse Assistant Job Satisfaction Scale. Excuse me. This is an 18-item scale. And the subscales are communication and recognition, amount of time to do work, available resources, teamwork, and management practices. And for this scale, for this instrument, you have to get permission to use it. So I'll make the point later that if you want to use an existing questionnaire, you sometimes have to ask permission to use them. These are the questions that measure the different dimensions. So the introduction would be, please tell me how satisfied you are with the working conditions, the way the nurse assistants here pitch in and help one another. And you can see how that statement is similar to the co-workers statement in the previous questionnaire, where it's talking more about co-workers not being kind of helpful, the recognition that you get for your work, the amount of responsibility, and so on. So if you look at the number of questions making up each construct at the bottom of the slide, I'm still online, yes, yeah. There's communication recognition has 5 questions, amount of time to do work has 2 questions, available resources has 2 questions, teamwork has 2 questions, and management practices has 7 questions. So if I was reviewing the questionnaire for use, I would those 2 item components would already be worrying me a bit, because when we're trying to measure a construct, a latent construct, we would normally want more than 2 items to measure that construct, because otherwise it's a very simple measurement. So the comment that I'm making here, 3 of the subconstructs only have 2 items, and we normally want to have 3 or more items making up a construct, just so that, and it's partly related to, if we do a reliability analysis on 2 items and we get a poor reliability, we can't remove any items from that scale, so because we've only got 2 to work with. If we have 4 items measuring available resources and we do reliability and we get a poor reliability, we still have a chance to maybe remove 1 or 2 questions to improve the reliability. So that's so if I see a scale with 2 items, we can use them, but it's not ideal. We'd prefer to have more items measuring a scale. But then, of course, the more items we have, the more questions we have, and that makes the questionnaire longer. Okay, so if you look at both of these questionnaires, neither of them are perfect. Some of the components have low reliability. For the other one, some of the components have too few items. So which one do you use? If you were a student doing work on job satisfaction and you were looking at these 2 instruments, do you use one or the other? How do you decide which one to use, or do you create a new measurement of job satisfaction? You could look for another option. So when you're measuring constructs which have been around for quite a long time, there's normally going to be more than one measurement of that construct, and then you have to kind of decide what definition are you going to use, which instruments might work, which ones are going to be good. And in this case, neither of them are perfect, but then you might need to use one of them anyway. So there's a risk there in terms of the quality of the validity of the questionnaires and so on. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Are there any questions so far at all? I haven't seen any hands up. Yeah. Are there any questions? I'm sorry, I haven't given you a break. I'm very sorry. But I'm just going to press on till 7. Yes, Fundo, yeah.
No, I'm saying I have no question. Oh, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, it was a thumbs up rather than a.
Yeah, it was the thumbs up. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So one of the questions the student needs to ask is there a pre-existing questionnaire that you can use? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel if the wheel is already made. So if the wheel has already been sort of designed. So when you're doing research and you want to use a questionnaire, you can either use an entire questionnaire that's been used before, or you can use selected questions from a questionnaire, or you can develop your own questions. So and then for options 1 and 2, there might be a choice of more than one definition and more than one operationalization. So if you're using job satisfaction, for example, I've just shown you 2 different questionnaires that measure job satisfaction. You could also take part of those questions. So if we go back to the other example with the attitudes towards statistics, you could say you're only interested in effect and cognitive competence and value. You're not really interested in difficulty, interest, and effort. So you can, if you were only focusing on effect, cognitive competence, and value, you would only use those questionnaires from the questionnaire. You're not going to use the difficulty, interest, and effort, and so on. So that's also an option. So you don't have to. It depends on your focus, what you want to measure. But you don't have to necessarily measure every dimension of the scale. And the same thing for these job satisfaction things. You might only be interested in pay, supervision, and contingent rewards, not so much an operating condition, or let's say pay, fringe benefits and contingent rewards, you're not interested in promotion or supervision or operating conditions or co-workers, for example, in which case you just take those components from the questionnaire. So you can take part of a questionnaire if you don't want to take all, if you're only focusing on certain kinds of dimensions of the broader concept of interest. Okay, so it's not plagiarism to take, I shouldn't say take. It's not plagiarism to use another researcher's questionnaire as long as you cite and acknowledge that person's questionnaire. I think because of plagiarism being a factor in students' work and research and so on, I think there's sometimes a misconception that using somebody else's design or using somebody else's questionnaire would be considered plagiarism, but that's not it's not the case, because what we do actually want to replicate research to be able to show that it's we can get the same result as somebody else, or maybe we want to show we can get a different result from somebody else. So there's nothing wrong with looking at somebody's design and saying, I'd like to use that, as long as you acknowledge where your design comes from. Some questionnaires would expect you to ask for permission to use them. And there's definitely certain kinds of questionnaires, particularly in psychology, for example, where they have they're measuring psychological constructs, and they can only really be used. They can often only be used by a professional psychologist, for example. So they would be those kinds of questionnaires. You would need to get permission to use them, and sometimes only professionals can use them. So even if you're just a sort of normal researcher who's not working in the psychological discipline, you wouldn't be able to use those kinds of formal sort of instruments. But often questionnaires are published, or they've been published in a journal, and sometimes the researchers will very happily share the questionnaire with you. And sometimes if a paper's been published, you can often work out what the questions were that were asked in the questionnaire from the tables that are included in the research paper. So even if you can't get access to the original questionnaire, you can still probably work out what questions were asked from the description and the methodology and from the tables provided in the paper. And the key thing is to provide acknowledgement. And if you're making changes to the questionnaire, you need to just acknowledge, or just describe what changes you've made, so that they're aware that you have made, or that the readers are aware that you've made changes. When you use an existing questionnaire, it allows you to compare your results to other researchers, which is a good thing to be able to do. If you design your own, and it's different from somebody else's, you wouldn't be able to directly compare what the results that you get to what somebody else has found. So that's an important thing to remember, and that's why it's good to use good quality questionnaires that have been used already. If you decide to design your questionnaire from scratch, you would then need to test the reliability and validity of your questionnaire before using it to collect information to answer your research questions. So that it gives you an extra step, and it's quite a complex step to follow so you have to kind of show that your questionnaire is valid and reliable if you're just designing a new one, depending on what kinds of questions you're asking as well. So if you're doing that, you need to take an extra step, which is quite a significant step of collecting data, testing and validating the questionnaire. And then once you've got the final questionnaire, you'd have to go and collect a new sample and then do the analysis that you wanted to do originally. So it's got a very important implication. So sometimes what people do if they're designing a new questionnaire is they will collect a very large sample, and then they'll split the sample into half, and they'll do the validation and reliability on half the sample, and then they'll do the analysis on the other half of the sample. But in order to do that, you need to get a very big sample, though. So researchers sometimes would do that to save time and effort. Yeah. And then a very important point, not all questionnaires are good quality. I always make a joke that academics love to promote their work, and sometimes they're promoting work which might not be that good quality. So when you see questionnaires out there, you need to evaluate them for validity and reliability. And just because it's been used and published and because somebody's promoting it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good quality. So you as a supervisor and your students need to learn to evaluate reliability and validity of existing questionnaires. So as I mentioned earlier, I would look at this table here and say, okay, well, these reliabilities are not good. So that would raise a question to me about the operating procedures and co-workers measurement for this job satisfaction scale. And then I'd look at this co-worker scale and think, I don't like that. It's not giving good reliability. I don't think the questions are working very well. So I'm going to design my own, or I'm going to find another measure of co-worker to use in my study. So that's the kind of process I would follow. And then this one here, I'd say, okay, well, a lot of these questions a lot of these subcomponents only have 2 items. I would like to have more, or find something which measures those a bit more convincingly. So that's the kind of analysis that you need to be able to do with a questionnaire. Okay. So then you need to kind of know what the processes are that we look for validity and reliability, and we would have learned some of those in the section on reliability and validity. And then we'll also maybe look at those a bit more detail in the analysis section. Am I clear what I will use in each section? So when you have a questionnaire, you're going to have section A, B, C, and D. Obviously, you could have more sections, you could have fewer sections, depending on what you're measuring. But the key thing is to make sure that the questions are grouped in logical groupings, and then within the sections, they're also put into a logical sequence. That's usually not a major problem with questionnaires that we see, but there are sometimes instances where students put questions in very odd orders. It's very strange sort of grouping, ordering of questions, which is not always very good. So in terms of the kinds of questions, we can ask open, closed questions. We can ask factual and non-factual questions. So this is just making a point that we can ask questions in many different ways, and that the kind of and the key thing is to ask the question in a way which would help us get the most useful information from the participants. And then I'm going to jump this question because it's just showing that there's lots of different kinds of questions. And then this is the most important part, is what kind of response type will you get from each question, because this links into statistical analysis. So when we ask questions, I'm not going to ask you to answer the questions because we're running out of time a bit. I'm just going to give you the answers. So when we ask questions, we can get 3 kinds of responses. We can get nominal or categorical response, we can get an ordinal response, or we can get a numerical or interval response. So a number is where we ask a question which gives us so let's say we say, how much do you earn every month? And then the person gives you a rand value for that, and to answer that question. That's an example of a question giving a numeric response. Or how many hours do you spend studying per week? That would be an example of a question giving you a numeric or interval response. And then we get different types of numeric response that could be discrete, continuous, or ratios. The ordinal response is where we ask the person to rate something. We say, how satisfied are you with I'm thinking a different question. If I go back to this question here, this is an example of an ordinal question, or set of ordinal questions. This question here, please tell me how satisfied are you with each of the following. The working conditions here: very satisfied, satisfied, dissatisfied, very dissatisfied. That's an example of an ordinal scale. So there's an order to the responses, and there's a logical order to that sequence. So you wouldn't say dissatisfied, very satisfied, very dissatisfied, satisfied. That logic doesn't make any sense. You would put the responses in a logical order. So there's an order. So it's a scale response, essentially. So that's an example of questions where we're getting an ordinal response. Okay. And we use those commonly when we're asking people about their attitudes, and if we're asking people to rate how often something happens and so on. The third type of response is a nominal or categorical response, and that's where we ask a question where we get an answer, but there's no there's no kind of inherent order to the answer. So if we say, what is your marital status? We could say single, married, widow, divorced, or we could say divorced, married, single, widowed. There's no kind of necessarily logical order to the responses, and there doesn't need to be. So that's an example of a question. And the kind of response that we get will be influencing the kind of statistical tests that we can do later on. So that's why the kind of questions that we ask are important in terms of what kind of analysis we can do later on. So all these things are linked together. So that exercise in activity in assessment 1, where we ask the question, does the analysis link to the variables that have been measured? That's why we ask those questions. If the person's measured only nominal categorical variables, that's going to limit the kind of analysis that they can do to analysis which is appropriate for nominal or categorical variables. Okay. So, and I mentioned that I would talk about, I need to, okay, I'm going to send you a file. I'm going to send you a document, which I won't show it now just because of time. But when we use ordinal responses, as I mentioned earlier, often people use strongly agree, strongly disagree, but there's a whole range of options we can use to measure different dimensions. So we can measure frequency, like never, really, sometimes, often, always. We can measure quality, very poor through to excellent. So there's a lot of different dimensions we can measure using ordinal questions. So this is just to highlight that. The slide just highlights that, and I'll send you a 2-page document which shows you the kinds of response options that you can use for ordinal questions, and it's quite interesting to see what kinds of things that you can measure. Yeah, and then there's a lot of debate about ordinal questions, about should you use a neutral category, do we use a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale, do you start with a negative end and go to the positive end, that kind of thing. But so you need to, if you're using a questionnaire and you're using ordinal scales, those are some of the kind of things that you could go into look into there. And these are just some other points about ordinal scales. I'm not going to go into much detail about those now. Yeah, and then I think I'm going to stop here. I'm going to end here on this. So this is the analysis plan, and we're going to go into more detail with this in the next session. So this is just an example of what this slide is showing is that it's showing on the right-hand side, you've got statistical tests, and then there's a set of questions that you need to ask to get to the test. So the first question, and this is where we go back to the theory. So we started this session talking about, do you have a theoretical proposition? Which kind of asks the question, do you have dependent and independent variables? So the first question you ask is, how many dependent variables do you have, or how many outcome variables do you have? And the options there are 1 or 2 or more. The next question is, what kind of outcome variable is it? Is it a continuous variable, or is it a categorical variable? And then the answer to that question would you make a choice based on that answer. For this table, we would consider an ordinal variable as being a categorical variable, because ordinal variables sit between interval variables and categorical variables, and sometimes you can treat them as being a continuous variable, but it's not statistically, that's not the kind of correct thing to do. So we would normally treat an ordinal variable as an individual ordinal variable as a categorical variable. But when we combine ordinal variables into a score, then we would treat that as a continuous variable. And that's one of the reasons why when we measure latent constructs, we use more than one variable so that we can get a score, an average for that variable, and then we treat it as being a continuous variable. Okay, the next question is how many predictor variables or how many independent variables are there? And there's one or two or more. The next question is what type of predictor is it? Is it a categorical predictor or a continuous predictor? Then we have another question is the categorical predictor, how many categories? 2 or more than 2? And then if it's a categorical predictor, are the groups, if there's groups, are the groups, are the members of the groups the same or are they different? And then the final question is, does the data meet the assumptions for parametric tests? And then that then gives us a test to use. So I'm going to go into much more detail in this table in the analysis section, which will be the next session. But this gives you this. So what's important from this table to understand is that the choice of tests that we end up with is determined by the kinds of variables that we're working with. A dependent variable, what's the nature of that dependent variable? What kind of predictors do we have? What is the nature of those predictors? And then some other questions relating to the groups that if we've got categorical variables, how big are how many groups are there? And then what is the composition of those groups? And that will get us to a statistical test. So I'm going to go into more detail on that in the next session. But that's, yeah, so your question there will give you, or any other instrument that you're using to measure will give you measurements for variables, which you could then put into this table to decide what kind of test you're going to be using. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Very complex, I might say.
Okay, so yeah, Theodora, don't worry. I'm going to go into detail in the table in the next session in more detail. Okay, it's not once you've got the hang of it, it's not as complicated as it looks. Okay, so it's just and I'll give you some examples to use. We'll go through some examples of how to get to a test based on the kinds of measurements that we make. So don't worry about that too much now. I know it looks complicated, but it's not actually. There's a lot of structure to it. I think that's the key thing to remember. So it's not like you're sitting there with a set of interviews with all these complicated words and combinations of ideas and things where you have to try and make sense of it. This is much more kind of structured. Yeah. But anyway, okay. And so any questions at all? No. Okay. Okay. All right, so I'm going to end the session then. If you have any questions, I'll stay on for a couple of minutes, just if you have any other questions, and then otherwise I'll see you on Saturday. And if you have any other questions, you're welcome to drop me an email as well. Okay.
Thanks for the session.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay.